There are mothers who spend their entire lives working, sacrificing and believing that one day their children will understand everything they've done. But sometimes, what waits for them after a husband's funeral isn't family standing together. It's a cold decision, a cruel dismissal, and a house that suddenly no longer has a place for them. And in that moment, the hardest truth isn't losing money or property. It's realizing how quickly love can disappear when inheritance enters the room. There's a saying people often repeat: character is revealed when money is involved. The real nature of someone often shows up the moment an inheritance is on the table. But when that truth finally surfaces, should a family try to hold everything together or let the consequences unfold exactly as they should? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now I want to invite you to hear her story, The Will That Broke a Family. 3 weeks after Harrison Calder was buried beneath the oak trees of Magnolia Hill Cemetery, I found myself sitting in the polished leather chair across from Nathaniel Graves' desk, waiting to hear what was left of a life we had built together. The office was exactly the same as it had always been. Dark wood shelves, heavy curtains, and that faint scent of old paper and polished oak that seemed to cling to every law office in Charleston. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun filtered through Spanish moss hanging from the trees. Inside the room felt colder than it should have. Marcus sat beside me, leaning back in his chair, as if he were waiting for a meeting to end so he could move on to something more interesting. My son had always had a restless energy, but that day it looked more like impatience. Nathaniel Graves cleared his throat and adjusted the papers in front of him. "I want to begin by saying again how sorry I am for your loss," he said carefully. I nodded, though the words barely registered anymore. People had been saying them for 3 weeks. Marcus didn't respond at all. He simply tapped his phone against the armrest and looked out the window. Mr. Graves began reading. The language was formal, the way legal language always is, precise, slow, almost detached from the emotions it was about to stir. Harrison Calder's estate, the document said, would be distributed according to the instructions he had signed 6 months before his death. My hands rested quietly in my lap while the lawyer spoke, but inside my chest, something was tightening with every sentence. Then came the first part that made Marcus sit up straight. The property located at Lake Como, Italy, commonly referred to as the Calder Villa, will be transferred in full to Marcus Calder. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Well," he said with a grin, "that's not a bad start." Nathaniel continued. "The majority share of Calder Coastal Development will also pass to Marcus Calder." Marcus leaned forward now, his grin widening. "And the residential property located on Trad Street in Charleston will likewise be transferred to Marcus Calder." That was our home. The house Harrison and I had lived in for 35 years. The house where Marcus had taken his first steps in the hallway and where Harrison had planted roses along the front gate every spring. Marcus looked at me for the first time since we had sat down. "Guess I'll have to start looking for a good real estate agent," he said lightly. I didn't answer. My mind was still waiting for the rest. Nathaniel Graves turned the page. "The remaining property located at Aspen Ridge, Colorado, specifically the mountain cabin on Parcel 18C, will be transferred to Serafina Vale Calder." Silence filled the room. Marcus frowned. "A cabin," he said. Mr. Graves nodded. "Yes." Marcus leaned back again and laughed under his breath. "So Dad leaves me the villa in Italy and the company, and Mom gets a cabin in the mountains." He turned toward me with a smirk that felt sharper than any insult. "Well," he said, "I guess that's fair." Nathaniel Graves shifted uncomfortably. Marcus stood and walked toward the window, shaking his head. "A rotting mountain cabin," he muttered. "That's actually perfect." Then he turned back toward me. "Mom, you should see the bright side," he said. "At least you've got somewhere to go." I felt Nathaniel's eyes flick toward me, waiting for some kind of reaction, but none came. I had been married to Harrison Calder for 35 years. I had stood beside him when he built his company from a small office above a seafood restaurant into a real estate firm that owned half the waterfront in Charleston. I had helped raise Marcus. I had watched Harrison grow older, watched the lines form around his eyes, watched the long nights at the hospital when cancer first came for him 15 years ago. And now I was sitting in a lawyer's office listening to the final summary of a life we had built together. Apparently, I was worth a cabin. Marcus grabbed his jacket. "Well," he said, "this has been interesting." He looked at me again this time with something colder in his expression. "I'm putting the Charleston house on the market next week," he said casually, "so you might want to start packing." The words landed slowly. "You're selling the house?" I asked. "Of course," he replied. "That place is worth a fortune, and I've got plans." I stared at him. "This is my home." Marcus shrugged. "Not anymore." Nathaniel Graves cleared his throat again, but neither of us looked at him. Marcus checked his watch. "I'll give you 48 hours, he said. 48 hours. 35 years, reduced to 2 days. The meeting ended shortly after that. I don't remember leaving the office. I only remember the heat of the Charleston afternoon and the strange feeling of walking through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. When I stepped back into the house on Trad Street that evening, it looked exactly the same as it always had. The white shutters, the long hallway, the staircase Harrison had insisted on restoring by hand instead of replacing. But something had shifted. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the dining table, the photograph of Marcus on his high school graduation day. 35 years. The early years had been good. Harrison had been ambitious but warm, the kind of man who laughed easily and believed the world could be built from scratch if you worked hard enough. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. The business grew larger. The travel increased. The phone calls came later at night. And Harrison began disappearing for days at a time. At the time, I had told myself it was work. Now I wasn't so sure. By midnight, I had packed everything that truly belonged to me. 2 suitcases, a small box of photographs, and the toolbox Harrison had given me 20 years ago when I decided I would learn to fix things around the house myself. Everything else would stay, because apparently none of it had ever been mine. At 2 a.m, I loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of my car. The Charleston air was warm and heavy as I stood in the driveway looking at the house for the last time. Then I got in the car, and I started driving west, the road to Aspen Ridge. Driving away from Charleston in the middle of the night felt like leaving behind an entire lifetime. For the first few hours, the road was familiar. The dark outline of the Atlantic coastline, the long highways stretching across South Carolina. But by sunrise, the world had already begun to change. The road carried me into the rolling hills of the Appalachian Mountains. Mist clung to the valleys, and the early morning light painted the trees in soft shades of gold and green. I drove with the windows cracked open, letting the cool air keep me awake. 3 days on the road gives a person a lot of time to think. And the further I drove, the more the memories of my life with Harrison began rising one by one. When we first met, he had been working out of a tiny office above a seafood restaurant near the harbor. I still remember the smell of shrimp and salt water drifting up the staircase the first time he showed me his plans for the company he wanted to build. He was confident even then. Confident and charming. We were young enough to believe that hard work could solve anything. The company grew faster than either of us expected. By the time Marcus was born, Harrison was already closing deals with developers up and down the coast. But success came with a price. The travel started first, just a few days in Miami, he would say, or Atlanta, or sometimes Denver. I had never questioned it. That's what business owners do. They travel, they meet investors, they close deals. But as the miles rolled beneath my tires, I began remembering small details I had ignored for years. Phone calls Harrison always took outside, trips he never explained clearly, receipts for flights I didn't remember him mentioning. At the time, none of it had seemed important. Now every memory felt like a missing puzzle piece. By the second day, the Appalachian hills had faded into the long, flat stretches of Kansas. Endless plains, wheat fields stretching to the horizon, the sky so wide it felt almost unreal. I drove through small towns where gas stations doubled as grocery stores and where the same pickup trucks sat parked outside diners from sunrise until evening. The road kept pulling me west, and by the third day the land began to rise again. The Rocky Mountains appeared slowly first as distant shadows against the sky, then as towering walls of stone and forest. Aspen Ridge lay somewhere inside those mountains. Nathaniel Graves had given me a map with the deed papers. It took another 2 hours of winding roads before I finally reached the narrow dirt road that led toward the cabin. Tall pine trees surrounded the path. The air smelled of resin and cold mountain wind. The road grew narrower the deeper I drove. Finally, it ended in a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. Marcus had not exaggerated. The place looked like it had been fighting the mountain weather for decades and losing. The blue paint had faded to a dull gray. Several boards on the porch hung crooked. The windows were covered with wooden panels nailed across the frames. I stepped out of the car and listened. Nothing but wind in the trees. This was what Harrison had left me, a rotting mountain cabin in the middle of nowhere. I stood there for a long moment staring at it. Then I walked up the creaking wooden steps to the door. The key Nathaniel had given me felt cold in my hand. For a second, I hesitated. This place was supposed to be my new life, or at least what was left of it. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened slowly, and I stepped inside for the first time, bracing myself for whatever waited beyond that threshold. The cabin wasn't abandoned. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside the cabin was the smell. It wasn't the damp, moldy scent I had expected from a building that looked like it had been forgotten for years. Instead, the air carried a faint hint of lavender and pine, clean, almost comforting. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the narrow windows. Then I looked around. There was no dust. Not on the coffee table, not on the bookshelves, not even along the window frames where dust always settles first. The wooden floor beneath my feet had been swept recently. I could see faint lines where a broom had passed across the boards. That didn't make sense. The outside of the cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet the inside felt quietly lived in. I walked farther into the room. A faded blue blanket was folded neatly over the back of a couch. The cushions were worn but clean, the kind of clean that comes from regular use, not from being covered and forgotten. On the small coffee table sat a mason jar filled with wildflowers, yellow and purple blossoms that looked like they had been picked from somewhere nearby. They were fresh. Not perfectly fresh, but not wilted either. Someone had placed them there recently. My eyes moved slowly across the room as the uneasy feeling in my chest began to grow. This wasn't an abandoned cabin. Someone had been here. I stepped into the small kitchen. The sink caught my attention immediately. 2 plates rested in the drying rack beside the faucet. A fork and a spoon lay neatly on a folded dish towel. Water droplets still clung to the edges of the plates. They had been washed not long ago. My pulse began to quicken. I opened the refrigerator. The quiet hum of the motor filled the room as the light flicked on. Inside was a half carton of milk, a container of leftover soup, a small bag of apples, and a jar of mustard. Nothing fancy, just simple food. But it was fresh food, not something left behind months ago. I closed the refrigerator slowly. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed through the cabin. No answer. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. I moved down the short hallway that led to the bedroom. A narrow bed stood against the far wall. The blankets were pulled tight and smooth across the mattress. A small reading lamp sat on the nightstand beside a stack of medical books. Medical books. Titles about neuromuscular disorders and rehabilitation therapy. That was when I noticed the medications. Several prescription bottles were lined up carefully beside the books. I picked one up. The label read, Leora Ash Quinn. The name meant nothing to me, but the address printed beneath it did. Aspen Ridge Cabin. My hands felt strangely cold as I set the bottle back down. Who was Leora Ash Quinn, and why was she living in the cabin Harrison had left to me? I walked back into the living room, my eyes scanning every corner now with a new awareness. That was when I noticed the album. It sat on the corner of the coffee table, its leather cover slightly worn from use. I hesitated before opening it. Something in my chest already knew that whatever waited inside those pages would change things. Still, I lifted the cover. The first photograph stopped my breath. It was Harrison. He stood in front of the very cabin I was standing in now. But he looked different. Not the serious, tired man I had known in the final years of his life. In this photo, he was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Beside him stood a young woman. She had dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a warm, open smile. Her hand rested lightly on Harrison's arm. They looked comfortable together, familiar. I turned the page. Another photograph showed them sitting on the cabin's front porch. Harrison held a mug of coffee while the woman laughed at something he had said. In the next picture, they were standing in the kitchen, both of them leaning over a pot on the stove. Another showed them walking along a trail in the forest behind the cabin. The photographs continued for several pages. Harrison and the same young woman, cooking, reading, talking. In every picture, Harrison looked relaxed, happy. The kind of happiness that had slowly disappeared from our house in Charleston over the years. I felt something inside my chest tighten. How many times had Harrison come here? How many of his business trips had actually been visits to this cabin? I closed the album slowly. The room seemed quieter than before. My mind was still trying to process what I had seen when a sound reached my ears. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps moving across the wooden porch outside. I froze where I stood. The boards creaked softly under someone's weight. Then the door handle began to turn. The woman at the door. The door opened before I had time to decide what to do. A woman stepped inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She was younger than I expected, early 30s maybe, and she moved carefully, supporting herself with a pair of forearm crutches. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and her face carried the kind of calm that comes from someone who has learned to manage pain quietly. She stopped just inside the doorway when she saw me. Our eyes met. Instead of surprise, her expression shifted into something closer to recognition. "You must be Serafina Calder," she said. Hearing my name from a stranger made my stomach tighten. "Yes," I replied slowly, "and you are." She closed the door behind her with one hand and leaned lightly against her crutches. "My name is Leora," she said. "Leora Ash Quinn, the same name from the medication bottles." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she glanced toward the living room and noticed the open photo album on the table. "I see you found the pictures," she said gently. My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Why are you in this cabin?" Leora didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved farther into the room with careful steps and lowered herself into the chair across from the couch. The way she moved suggested she had done this many times before, as if this place belonged to her. "I've been living here," she said finally. The words settled into the room like dust. "This cabin belongs to me," I said. "Not exactly," she replied quietly. I felt my hands clench at my sides. "This property was left to me by my husband." Leora met my gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said, "I know." Silence filled the cabin again. Then she added something that made the ground shift beneath my feet. "Harrison bought this place 3 years ago," she said, "for me." My mind struggled to follow her words. "For you," she nodded. "He wanted me to have somewhere quiet, somewhere close to the medical center in Denver." I shook my head slowly. "That doesn't make any sense." Leora watched me for a long moment as if deciding how much to say. Then she reached into the canvas bag resting beside her chair and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside were several papers. She handed one to me. It was a birth certificate. I scanned the document, automatically reading the name at the top. Leora Ash Quinn. Then my eyes dropped to the line that listed the father, Harrison Calder. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "That's not possible," I whispered. Leora's voice remained calm. "He had me when he was 18. I stared at the paper, unable to process the words. "My grandparents forced him to give me up for adoption," she continued softly. "They were worried about the family name." My mind filled with fragments of memories. Harrison's distant trips, his unexplained absences, the weekends he said he was meeting investors. Leora spoke again. "He found me 2 years ago." I looked up. "He hired a private investigator," she said. "He said he had been looking for me for a long time." The photo album on the table suddenly made sense in a way I didn't want it to. Every picture, every smile, every moment Harrison had spent here. I lowered myself slowly onto the couch. "You're saying—" My voice faltered. "You're saying Harrison was your father?" "Yes," Leora said. I felt as if the past 35 years of my life had been quietly rearranged without my knowledge. Every memory with Harrison now carried a shadow I had never seen before. "How long did you know him?" I asked. 2 years, she answered, "before he got sick again." Her words echoed in the quiet room. 2 years. 2 years of visits. 2 years of secrets. I looked around the cabin once more. The flowers, the books, the photographs. All of it suddenly belonged to a part of Harrison's life I had never known. My husband, the man I had shared a home with for 3 decades, had another daughter and another life, and somehow I had never seen it. The secret Harrison, carried for 30 years. For several minutes after Leora spoke the words, neither of us moved. The cabin felt smaller than it had before, as if the walls themselves were pressing closer around us. I could hear the wind outside moving through the tall pine trees, the sound rising and falling like a quiet breath. I looked down again at the birth certificate in my hands. Harrison Calder. The name that had defined my entire adult life now sat there beneath the word father for someone I had never known existed. My husband had another child, and he had kept that truth hidden for 35 years. I lifted my eyes slowly. "How long have you known about him?" I asked. Leora rested her hands lightly on the tops of her crutches. Her expression held a strange mixture of sadness and patience, as if she had rehearsed this conversation many times in her mind. "Not very long," she said quietly. "Only 2 years. 2 years." The number echoed in my mind. "That's when he found me," she continued. I waited. "He told me he had been trying for years," she said, "but my adoption records were sealed. It took a private investigator to finally track me down." I studied her face carefully. There was something about the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, something faintly familiar that I hadn't noticed when she first walked through the door. A piece of Harrison was there. "What happened back then?" I asked. She took a slow breath. "Harrison was 18 when I was born," she said. "My mother was 17. They were both still in high school. I could almost picture it. Charleston in the late 70s. The strict families, the expectations, the quiet ways scandals were buried before they could grow. My grandparents made the decision," Leora continued. "They told him the best thing he could do was let another family raise me." She glanced down briefly before continuing. "They said it would ruin his future if people found out." The words carried no anger, just a quiet understanding of a decision made long before either of us had any say in it. "So they arranged the adoption," she said. "And I grew up in Colorado with another family. I sat there absorbing every word." "Did he ever try to contact you before I asked?" Leora shook her head. "He told me he wanted to," she said. "But he was young, and his parents controlled everything back then. By the time he was independent enough to start searching, the trail had already gone cold. Her fingers traced the edge of the coffee table as she spoke. He said he thought about it every year. The room grew quiet again. And 2 years ago, he finally found you, I said. She nodded. He showed up right outside the physical therapy center in Denver. I blinked. You were already sick. Her expression softened. I was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy when I was 28. The words landed with quiet weight. Progressive, she added. It gets worse over time. I glanced briefly at the crutches beside her chair. Is that why? Yes, she said gently. My legs started weakening about 3 years ago. She looked around the cabin as she spoke. Harrison saw the condition I was living in when he found me. She continued. The apartment I had back then was small and expensive. Most of my money went to treatment. She paused for a moment. He offered to help. I felt something shift in my chest. He bought this cabin shortly after, she said. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I could afford to live. My eyes moved slowly around the room again. The flowers, the books, the careful order of everything. He paid for my treatments too, she added. I closed my eyes for a moment. For years I had watched Harrison disappear on those unexplained trips, and now I knew where he had been going. How often did he come here? I asked. Quietly. Every few weeks, Leora said, sometimes more. I let out a slow breath. That explained the missing weekends, the vague explanations, the quiet distance that had slowly grown between us during the final years of our marriage. He didn't want to hurt you, she said softly, as if reading the thoughts moving through my mind. I looked at her. He said he was trying to find the right time to tell you. The words hung in the air, but time had run out before that moment ever came. Leora shifted slightly in her chair. There was something else he was worried about, she said. My eyes lifted again. What do you mean he spent the last few months of his life looking into Marcus? The name struck something sharp inside me. Looking into him, how he said something about the finances not adding up. A chill moved slowly down my spine. What finances Leora reached for the canvas bag beside her chair. There were phone calls, she said, late at night sometimes. He would sit at the kitchen table here and go through documents. She pulled out a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. It was a simple cedar box with brass hinges, the kind you could buy at a craft store. But this one was different. I had made it myself when Marcus was still in elementary school. Harrison had always kept it on his desk in Charleston. I hadn't seen it in years. He told me if anything happened to him, Leora said carefully, I should give this to you. She placed the box on the table between us. He said you deserve to know the truth. I stared at it for several seconds before reaching forward. My fingers brushed the worn wood. Then I lifted the lid. The truth about Marcus. Inside the wooden box were several neatly stacked envelopes. The first one had my name written across the front in Harrison's familiar handwriting, Serafina. My hands felt strangely heavy as I opened it. The letter inside was only 2 pages long. I recognized the careful, slightly slanted handwriting immediately. Serafina. If you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to explain everything in person. The words blurred slightly as I forced myself to keep reading. For months, I have been trying to understand something that didn't make sense. I began noticing financial irregularities tied to Marcus. At first, I assumed it was a mistake in the company accounts, but the more I looked, the worse the numbers became. My heartbeat quickened as I turned to the second page. 3 months ago, a lender contacted me regarding a loan agreement bearing my signature. The amount was $870,000. I never signed such a document. The letter continued. I hired a financial investigator to trace the transaction history. The report is enclosed in this box. I lowered the letter slowly and reached for the next envelope. Inside was a thick packet of documents, bank statements, loan contracts, transaction records. Even without reading everything in detail, the numbers jumped off the pages. Marcus Calder, outstanding balance $870,000. My stomach tightened. I flipped through more pages. Several of the loan agreements included copies of signatures. Harrison Calder. Except the handwriting looked slightly wrong. Stiff, forced, forgery. Another section of the report detailed withdrawals from personal accounts. I felt a cold wave move through my chest as I read the numbers. Small amounts at first. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. Over and over again. The account names printed at the top of each page were painfully familiar. Joint savings, household reserve fund, my retirement account. Total unauthorized withdrawals approximately $140,000. My hands began to tremble. Marcus had taken money from us. Not once. Not twice. Over and over again. And Harrison had been quietly tracking every dollar. I picked up the letter again and continued reading. Marcus is in deeper trouble than he realizes. The lenders he is dealing with are not traditional banks. They operate through private lending networks that rarely forgive unpaid debts. If the situation continues to escalate, Marcus could face legal consequences far beyond financial penalties. I stared at the words for a long time. My son. The boy I had once rocked to sleep in the small bedroom upstairs in Charleston. The boy whose first bicycle Harrison had assembled in the driveway. That same boy now owed nearly $1 million to people who did not operate by ordinary rules. The letter continued. There is one more thing you need to know. I set the letter down and opened the final envelope. Inside were property maps, government planning documents, environmental survey reports. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then one number caught my attention. Parcel 18C, Aspen Ridge. The same parcel number printed on the deed Nathaniel Graves had given me. According to the documents, the federal government was preparing a major environmental research development across several thousand acres of mountain land. Aspen Ridge sat directly within the planned acquisition zone. One page listed estimated property valuations. Parcel 18C, projected acquisition value $3,400,000. $3.4 million. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin Marcus had mocked, the cabin he told me to go live in with the rats, was sitting on land worth more than the Charleston house, more than the company's shares, more than the villa in Italy. I was still staring at the number when my phone suddenly rang. The sharp sound cut through the quiet cabin like a blade. Marcus. His name flashed across the screen. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I answered. The voice on the other end sounded nothing like the confident man who had stood in the lawyer's office 3 weeks earlier. Mom Marcus said his words rushed and uneven. I need your help. Behind his voice, I could hear something else. Fear. Real fear. The confrontation on the mountain. Marcus arrived 2 days later. The narrow road leading to the cabin had been silent all morning. Leora had been resting in the bedroom while I sat at the kitchen table with Harrison's letters spread out in front of me, rereading certain lines again and again. Around noon, the quiet was broken by the distant growl of an engine climbing the mountain road. I walked to the window. A black SUV appeared between the tall pine trees, moving too fast for the narrow dirt path. The tires kicked up clouds of dust as it lurched around the final curve before stopping abruptly in front of the cabin. Marcus climbed out of the driver's seat. For a moment, I barely recognized him. The Marcus I had seen in Charleston 3 weeks earlier had been polished and confident, wearing a tailored jacket and speaking with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world was under control. The man standing in the clearing now looked different. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept in days. He slammed the car door and looked around the clearing as if expecting someone to appear from the trees. Then his eyes landed on the cabin. I opened the door before he could knock. He walked straight inside without greeting me. "Mom," he said quickly, "we need to talk." His voice carried an urgency that made the air in the room feel tense. Leora remained in the hallway behind me, quiet but observant. Marcus stopped when he noticed her. "Who's that?" he asked. "My name is Leora," she said calmly. Marcus glanced between us. "Look, I don't have time for introductions," he muttered. "I need your help." I folded my arms. Help with what? Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "They're coming after me." The words came out fast, almost breathless. "Who is the lenders?" he said. "The ones from the loans." I studied him carefully. "How much do you owe them?" He hesitated. Then he looked away. "It's complicated." I walked to the table and picked up the stack of documents from the wooden box. $870,000, I said quietly. Marcus froze. His eyes flicked to the papers in my hand. "Where did you get those?" "Your father left them." The room fell silent. Marcus swallowed hard. "Mom, listen," he said. "You don't understand how this works. These people don't go through the courts." "I know," I replied. I placed the financial report on the table in front of him. Marcus stared down at the pages. "You forged your father's signature," I said. He didn't respond. "You also withdrew $140,000 from my accounts." Still nothing. Finally, he sank into a chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "I was going to fix it," he muttered. "How I had a plan." "What plan?" Marcus leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "I owed money to the casinos in Miami," he admitted quietly. The words hung in the air. "How much?" At first, he said bitterly, 50,000. My chest tightened. Then 100. He let out a hollow laugh. And then it just kept getting worse. Marcus explained that he had started visiting casinos 5 years earlier during business trips. At first, it had been occasional games with clients' small bets that felt harmless. But over time, the stakes had grown. The losses grew even faster. "When I couldn't cover the debts, I borrowed money," he said. "From who? Private lenders. The kind of lenders who don't send polite reminders when payments are late." Marcus rubbed his temples. I thought I could win it back. The same sentence gamblers have repeated for generations. "I was going to sell the villa in Italy," he continued. "That would have covered everything. But the property value dropped," I said. He looked at me sharply. "You know about that?" "Yes." Marcus exhaled slowly. "The market collapsed after the water rights dispute. The place isn't worth half of what it was last year." He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "Mom, you have to help me. These people aren't patient. They've already started making threats." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I think they might kill me." The room grew painfully quiet. For a moment, the only sound was the wind brushing against the cabin walls. I looked at the man sitting across from me. My son. The boy who once cried when his bicycle scraped the pavement. Now a grown man afraid for his life because of the choices he had made. Without speaking, I reached into the wooden box and removed the final envelope. Marcus watched every movement. "What's that?" he asked. "The last letter your father wrote." I opened it carefully. The final legacy. The letter inside the envelope was longer than the first one. Harrison's handwriting filled 3 pages. I began reading aloud. "Serafina, if Marcus has come to you by the time you read this, it means the situation has reached the point I feared it would." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "For the past several months, I have been preparing a way to prevent our son from destroying the rest of his life." My voice remained steady as I continued. "I have sold several personal assets that were never part of the public estate. My watch collection, 2 investment properties, and the life insurance policy that matured last winter." Marcus looked up. What the letter continued. "The total value of those assets amounts to approximately $1,100,000. I lowered the page slowly and met Marcus's eyes. 1.1 million, I said. His expression changed instantly. "Dad left money." "Yes." Hope flashed across his face. Then I turned the page. "But the funds will not be transferred directly to Marcus." Marcus's shoulders stiffened. "The money will instead be placed in a trust administered by Nathaniel Graves. Its purpose is to pay off Marcus's outstanding debts in full." Marcus leaned forward again. "So the debt gets paid." "Yes," I said. But I kept reading. This payment comes with one condition. Marcus must enter a professional gambling addiction treatment program for a minimum of 12 months. If he refuses treatment or abandons the program early, the trust will immediately cease all financial assistance. Marcus's face darkened. You can't be serious. I finished the final paragraph. This is not punishment. It is the only way I know to give our son a second chance before the consequences become permanent. The room fell silent. Marcus looked away. For the first time since arriving, he seemed unsure of what to say. After several minutes, he spoke quietly. He knew. Yes. Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought I hid it from him. He knew long before you realized. I placed the letter back inside the envelope. There's something else I said. I pulled out the government documents about the Aspen Ridge property. Marcus glanced at them impatiently. What does that have to do with anything? The cabin land is being purchased by the federal government. He frowned. So? For $3.4 million. Marcus blinked. What the purchase agreement lists the property value? His eyes widened. $3.4 million. Yes. I placed another sheet on the table. Harrison already decided how the money would be divided. Marcus's gaze moved across the document. Leora Quinn. He read aloud. He looked toward her for the first time since entering the cabin. Who is she? My daughter, I said quietly. Marcus stared at me. You have a sister. Leora remained calm. Harrison left $2 million from the property sale to Leora. I continued. Marcus turned back to the page, and the rest, $1.4 million, goes to me. Marcus's eyes dropped to the final line. His name was not listed. You get nothing from the property, I said. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. So I lose the house, the villa, the company, everything. Yes. He looked at the floor for a long time. Then he spoke again. So the only thing Dad left me is rehab. I nodded. Marcus rubbed his face slowly. For a moment I expected anger. Instead, he simply looked tired. I guess I deserve that, he said quietly. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Marcus left the cabin just before sunset, driving back down the mountain road with the same dust trailing behind his tires. But this time, something in his expression had changed. Not relief, not happiness. Something closer to acceptance. Months passed. The government finalized the Aspen Ridge purchase agreement exactly as the documents predicted. Leora moved into a small house closer to the medical center in Denver where she could continue treatment. I moved into a nearby town so I could help her when she needed it. We spoke about Harrison often during those months, about the choices he made, about the years he spent trying to repair mistakes from the past. Marcus entered the treatment program 2 weeks after leaving the mountain. The first few months were difficult, but the reports from the center slowly improved. One afternoon, nearly a year later, my phone rang. Marcus's voice sounded different, calmer. I finished the program today, he said. There was a long pause on the line. I'm sorry, he added. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything else he could have said. After the call ended, I stepped outside onto the porch. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath the fading afternoon light. Harrison had spent his final months quietly preparing a way to save the people he loved, not with grand gestures, but with careful decisions, decisions that forced the truth into the open and gave our fractured family a chance to begin again. Some stories end quietly, not with a dramatic victory, but with a deeper understanding of the people we once thought we knew. What stayed with me, after everything, wasn't the money, the property, or even the secrets Harrison carried for so many years. It was the realization that families are rarely as simple as we imagine. Sometimes love and mistakes live side by side for decades, and it takes time, sometimes a lifetime, for the truth to surface in a way that can heal rather than destroy. In the end, what mattered most wasn't who received more or less. It was that the chance to begin again still existed. Life has a strange way of revealing our character when everything familiar falls apart. We often think strength means holding on tightly to what we believe is ours, but sometimes strength looks quieter than that. Sometimes it means stepping back, listening, and allowing compassion to grow where resentment could easily take root. When we do that, something unexpected happens. The past stops being a prison and slowly becomes a lesson. If this story resonated with you, we'd truly love to know where you're listening from today. This community continues to grow because people from all over the world gather here simply to listen and share moments like this together. If you'd like to stay with us for more stories like this one, subscribing is one small way to keep the conversation going. And if you feel comfortable, you're always welcome to leave a few lines in the comments. Sometimes the most meaningful reflections come from the quiet thoughts people choose to share. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are, take care of yourself and the people around you. And until we meet again in the next story, we'll be right here listening.